I never thought I'd be writing this, and honestly, part of me is still shaking while I type out these words, but I need to know if I'm the crazy one here, or if my life has actually turned into a literal horror movie. Imagine walking into your own sanctuary, the one place you're supposed to feel safe, and realizing that the person you trust most in the world, the man who raised you, who protected you, who tucked you in at night, has been watching your every move through a tiny, blinking lens hidden inside a wall clock. I caught my father spying on me in the most invasive way possible, and the look on his face when I confronted him wasn't one of guilt, but of cold, calculated justification. Was I wrong for tearing my family apart and calling the police on my own father? Or would you have done the exact same thing if you found out your privacy had been auctioned off for a sick sense of control? Please, tell me if I overreacted, because my mother is currently screaming at me for ruining our lives, but I feel like I finally escaped a cage I didn't even know I was in. To understand how I got here, you have to understand my dad. Growing up, everyone called him the super dad. He was attentive, always there to pick me up from school, always asking about my day, and incredibly protective. I used to think I was lucky. While my friends were dealing with flaky parents, my dad was always present. But looking back, that presence was more like a shadow. He was a pillar of our local community, a man who volunteered at every charity event and was known for his old-school values. People used to tell me how blessed I was to have a father who cared so much. I grew up in a house where everything was pristine, where rules were clear, and where my father's word was the final law. It didn't feel oppressive then. It just felt safe. Our Sundays were spent at community events, and he always walked with his chest puffed out, proud of the perfect family he had cultivated. He was the kind of man who would fix the neighbor's fence for free, but expect absolute silence and obedience at his own dinner table. When I turned 18 and started university, I stayed at home to save money. He insisted on it, saying the world was too dangerous for a young woman to be living in a dorm, telling me horror stories about campus life until I was too scared to even look at an apartment listing. He spoke about predators lurking in every hallway, about how other parents didn't care enough to keep their daughters safe, making me feel like my desire for independence was actually a lack of gratitude. He even renovated my room as a gift, adding new furniture and a beautiful, vintage-style wooden clock that he said he found at an antique shop. I loved it. I thought it was a touching gesture, a way of him saying that even though I was an adult now, I would always have a place in his home. He spent hours in there, painting the walls a soft beige, installing new shelving, and meticulously hanging that clock right across from my bed. For 2 years, that clock sat on my wall, ticking away while I changed, while I slept, while I had private phone calls with my boyfriend, and while I cried over failed exams. I had no idea that behind the Roman numerals was a high-definition lens connected to a private cloud server. The obsession started small, almost imperceptibly. He would accidentally mention things I had only talked about in my room. I'd be downstairs for breakfast and he'd say something like, "I heard that new indie band you like is touring," even though I'd only listened to them through my headphones upstairs. I remember the chill I felt when he mentioned a specific conversation I had with my best friend about my career doubts. He claimed he overheard me through the door, but the door was heavy oak and I was whispering. I convinced myself I was just being paranoid. After all, why would a man with his reputation do something so twisted? But then there were the check-ins. If I was 5 minutes late from a lecture, my phone would blow up. He would ask exactly who I was with and what we were doing, often describing the clothes I was wearing that morning with terrifying accuracy, as if he was memorizing my appearance to spot me in a crowd. He would even comment on my posture, telling me I looked tired or slumped over, as if he had been standing right next to me all day. I felt like I was being hunted by his affection, tracked by a love that felt more like a leash. Things took a dark turn last month when I started dating Mark. My dad hated him instantly, despite never meeting him. He started quoting things Mark and I had said to each other in private, intense, personal conversations that happened behind my closed bedroom door. He told me Mark was a bad influence because of things we discussed regarding our future plans I hadn't shared with anyone else. He even knew about a small birthmark Mark has on his shoulder, something I had only mentioned during a late-night video call. When I asked how he knew, he just smiled that sickening, calm smile and said, A father knows everything that goes on in his house, Sarah. I started getting paranoid. I checked for holes in the walls, I checked the vents, I even looked under my bed like a child, but I never suspected the clock. It was so organic, so much a part of the room. It was a centerpiece of the renovation he was so proud of. I began to feel like I was losing my mind, spiraling into a state of constant anxiety, where I felt watched even when I was alone. I started whispering in my own room, covering my mouth when I spoke on the phone, and keeping the lights off as much as possible. Then 2 nights ago, the super dad mask finally cracked. I was dusting my room, something I rarely do admittedly, and I knocked the clock off the wall. It hit the carpet with a thud, and the back panel popped open. I expected to see gears and a battery. Instead, I saw a sophisticated circuit board, a lithium battery pack, and a tiny camera lens aligned perfectly with a pinhole in the frame. My heart didn't just drop, it stopped. I stood there, the dust rag still in my hand, staring at the guts of a machine that had been recording my life. I felt a wave of nausea so strong I had to sit on the floor. I began to replay every moment I spent in that room. Every time I got out of the shower, every time I changed my clothes, every intimate conversation I had on the phone. It was all there, captured in high definition. I sat on the floor for what felt like hours, staring at this piece of plastic and wire that had been violating me for years. Every private moment of my womanhood, every secret, every vulnerable second was recorded. I felt physically sick. I realized that he wasn't just protective. He was a voyeur of my entire life. He had built a digital panopticon, and I was the only prisoner. I knew I had to confront him, but I also knew I needed proof before he could delete the footage, or find a way to manipulate the narrative as he always did. I plugged the device into my laptop, my hands shaking so hard I could barely type. What I found was even worse than I imagined. There were folders labeled by date, meticulously organized. He wasn't just watching live, he was archiving me. He had a digital library of my life. There were notes attached to some files, notes about my behavior, my moods, and my interactions with Mark. It was the digital diary of a stalker, and that stalker was my own father. I found footage from nights when I was sick, footage of me crying, footage of me just living my life, all stored away like some twisted trophy collection. One folder was titled Discipline Records, containing clips of every time he had yelled at me or I had talked back, followed by footage of me crying afterward. He was studying my reactions, analyzing my weaknesses like a scientist studying a lab rat. The sheer scale of the betrayal was suffocating. I realized then that my father didn't love me. He owned me. Or at least he thought he did. He had watched me grow from a teenager into a woman through a lens, bypassing every boundary of human decency. This brings me to a point where I genuinely need your perspective. I was standing there with the evidence in my hands, knowing that if I spoke up, my family would never be the same. My mom depends on him for everything. She hasn't worked in 20 years and sees him as the sun in our universe. My younger siblings look up to him as a hero, a moral compass who could do no wrong. And he is a respected man in our community, a man whose downfall would send shockwaves through our entire town. If I exposed him, the scholarship my brother was up for might be affected, our house might be lost, and my mother would be shattered. I knew that by exposing him, I was pulling the thread that would unravel our entire existence. But if I stayed silent, I would be a co-conspirator in my own abuse. I would be teaching my siblings that this is what love looks like. So that's the situation I was in, and I had to make a choice between my safety and my family's reputation. Before I tell you the explosive way I handled the confrontation and the revenge I took, I want you to pause and comment below what you would have done in my shoes. Would you have kept quiet to keep the peace, or would you have burned it all down? I chose to burn it all down. I waited until dinner when my mom and my younger brother were at the table. I wanted witnesses. I wanted him to see that his power was an illusion. I walked in, placed the clock right next to my father's plate of pasta, and set my laptop down facing my mother. I didn't say a word. I just pressed play on a screen recording of the file directory, showing the folders with my name and the dates. The silence in the room was deafening, broken only by the sound of my dad's fork hitting the floor. The metal clatter echoed through the dining room like a gunshot. He didn't even try to deny it at first. He just sat there, his face turning a deep, angry shade of red, the veins in his neck bulging. He looked at me and said, "I did it to keep you safe, Sarah. You don't know the things I've seen. I had to make sure you weren't making mistakes. You're too young to understand the dangers of this world." The audacity of his argument made me see red. He actually thought he was the hero of this story. He thought that by violating my most basic rights, he was performing a service. My mom started sobbing, not at him, but at me, begging me to put the computer away so we could talk about this privately. She kept saying, "Think of your father's job, think of the neighbors, think of what people will say at church." That was the moment I realized I was alone. My own mother was more afraid of the scandal than she was disgusted by her husband's behavior. She saw my violation as a family matter that should be swept under the rug. I stood up, walked to the phone, and called the police. My dad tried to grab the laptop, his eyes full of a rage I had never seen before, a predator who had been cornered, but I had already uploaded everything to a secure cloud link and sent it to my 3 best friends with instructions to post it if I disappeared, or if the files were deleted from my local drive. I looked him in the eye and told him, "You're not a father, you're a criminal." The confrontation turned physical for a moment as he tried to block the front door, screaming that I was destroying this family over nothing. My brother was frozen in terror, and my mother was hysterical, clawing at my arm to get me to hang up the phone. But I didn't budge. The police arrival was a blur of flashing lights and neighbors peeking through their curtains. I saw the look on the officers' faces when I showed them the hidden lens. It was a mix of horror and pity. They took the clock as evidence. My dad was escorted out in handcuffs, still screaming that he was a good father, and that I was ungrateful. He actually had the nerve to tell the police that I was mentally unstable, and that he was just monitoring my health because I was prone to episodes. Since then, the fallout has been a nightmare beyond anything I could have scripted. My mother has been bombarded by calls from the church and the neighborhood, and instead of supporting me, she blames me for destroying his career and ruining our financial future. She says I should have just taken the camera away and forgiven him, as if he had just accidentally read my diary instead of systematically filming me for years. The legal battle has been grueling. His lawyer tried to argue that since it was his house and I was over 18 but not paying rent, he had a right to monitor the safety of his premises. Can you believe that? The level of victim blaming is insane. I've had to sit in rooms with people who looked at me like I was the villain for tattling on the town's favorite son. But how do you forgive someone who stole your sense of self? How do you look at the man who taught you to ride a bike and realize he spent his evenings watching you sleep through a monitor? I've moved out and I'm staying with a friend, but the trauma follows me. I can't enter a room now without checking every corner. I find myself unscrewing smoke detectors and staring at picture frames, waiting for another lens to wink back at me. I've even started checking the mirrors in public bathrooms for two-way glass. Every time I see a smoke detector or a clock in a public place, I get a panic attack. I lost my father, but more importantly, I lost the version of him I loved. I lost the memory of my childhood because now everything feels like a lie. Was he watching me back then too? Was the super dad always just a mask for a man who couldn't handle not having total control? I lost my home, and I lost the support of my mother, who chose a predator over her own daughter's dignity. She actually tried to tell the police that I gave him permission, which was the final nail in the coffin of our relationship. I've blocked her number. I'm currently looking into a restraining order for both of them. My brother won't speak to me either. He thinks I'm the reason Dad isn't home for his graduation. The pressure to just move on is everywhere. But how can I move on when the person who was supposed to be my rock turned out to be the one crushing me? I've spent the last few weeks and a days wondering how many other families are living in this kind of perfect nightmare. I found out through the discovery process that my father had actually installed similar devices in the guest bathroom and the kitchen. He wasn't just watching me. He was watching everyone. My mother knows this now, and she still wants him back. That's the part that hurts the most. The realization that the people who should love you most are often the ones most willing to sell your safety for a bit of comfort. But even in the middle of this mess, I know I did the right thing. If I hadn't spoken up, he would have done this to my younger sister when she got older. He would have continued his reign of terror under the guise of protection forever. I am the cycle breaker, even if it means I have to stand alone in the wreckage. The moral of this story is that protection is never an excuse for the violation of privacy. If someone truly loves you, they trust you. They don't monitor you like a prisoner. Real love doesn't need a hidden camera to verify your worth or your safety. It doesn't need to archive your moments to prove its devotion. Trust is built on transparency, not on surveillance. I am currently going through the legal process, and I'm determined to see him held accountable, no matter how much my family tries to guilt-trip me into dropping the charges. They tell me I'm being vindictive, but I call it seeking justice. You have to stand up for yourself, even when the person you're standing up against is the one who gave you life. If you don't set boundaries, people will continue to treat your life like their own personal reality show. I'm starting therapy next week to try and rebuild my sense of safety, but it's going to be a long road. I'm learning to sleep with the door locked and the lights on. I hope my story serves as a warning to anyone who feels like something is off in their own home. Trust your gut. If your parents' care feels like a weight instead of a wing, something is wrong. Your privacy is a fundamental right, not a privilege granted by your parents. Never let anyone convince you that your discomfort is disrespect. Like this video if you were on my side and think I did the right thing by calling the police. It really helps to know there are people out there who understand why I had to do what I did, and that I'm not the monster my mother says I am. Subscribe for more stories like this where we expose the dark side of family secrets and the reality of life behind closed doors. We need to keep talking about these things so that other people in my position know they aren't alone, and they aren't crazy. Please share your final thoughts on this whole mess in the comments section. I'm reading all of them because I really need the support right now, and I want to hear if anyone else has dealt with a helicopter parent who took things way too far. Your comments are the only thing keeping me sane through this trial. I'll see you all in the next story.